Welcome to you all to this latest in the series of Joy in Enough monthly talks. Following on the heels of the great financial crash of 2008 and the ensuing great stagnation, the pandemic has left countries and businesses and households hopelessly and colossally, in many cases, indebted. But what do debt and credit, words like that, really mean? Are they just two sides of the same coin? Is one just the other with a minus sign in front of it? And what on earth, if anything, do they have to do with familiar Christian words that we use commonly? Ideas like faith and trust and promise. Well, here to help us explore these questions tonight is Philip Goodchild. Philip is Professor of Religion and Philosophy at the University of Nottingham and the author of a great many articles and books, including this one, Theology of Money, which came out in 2007 originally, I think it was, and more recently a trilogy, Credit and Faith, Economic Theology, and Metaphysics of Trust. And I must show you the cover of Credit and Faith because he's rather cleverly designed it so it looks like a credit card. Do you see? Nice touch, that. I like that very much. So it's really good to have Philip with us this evening. He spent many years reflecting on some of these fundamental issues. So a warm welcome to you, Philip. So the plan for this evening is for Philip and myself to natter away here for about half an hour or so. And while we're talking, please do put any questions which occur to you in the chat box. And one of our colleagues will collate all the questions as they come in, and I will put some of them, at least, time permitting, to Philip at the end. And our aim is to be done by 8:15 Greenwich Mean Time, I should stress, for our overseas participants this evening. Okay, so that's kind of the plan for tonight. And so without further ado, Philip, let me just kick you off with a question, very basic one, really. I suppose most people, many people, would see credit and debt as ideas that primarily belong in the financial world. It's the kind of thing that goes with an accountant's ledger, but doesn't necessarily feature very much that kind of language in Christian discussion. So what would you say credit and debt, how can we best understand those from a Christian point of view, and how, if at all, do they tie in with some of those basic Christian ideas such as faith and trust?
Well, thanks very much, John, for the question and for the invitation. And it's a delight to see so many people here. And I do hope you get the chance to ask me questions and offer me some challenges during this. I'm going to share my screen because I've made a few notes, and they will, because we're dealing with some quite tricky things, they may well help to elucidate some answers to your questions. So I'll pick and choose a bit from my slideshow as and when it comes up. Right. So you asked about credit, and I'm going to give here a working definition of what credit might be in its essence. We use the word credit in all sorts of different ways. So it's merely a matter of deciding which ways are fundamental. So here's a working definition. To give credit is to invest someone or something with significance and or trust. So that's what I think is a fundamental human phenomenon. And the more you think about this, the more you might start to see it as the basis of human life, the basis of how we relate to each other. Everything is based ultimately on trust or on taking certain things or certain people as mattering. And that might not be immediately evident. It involves some choice on our part to respond to them, to invest them with some significance or trust. So I want to suggest that this conception is somehow separate from economic conceptions. So to give you examples of different economic conceptions. I probably need to hide my screen there so you can see it all. There's credit as in credit rating, which means credit worthiness, a reputation for integrity that offers grounds for an economic relationship. That's a basic sense of credit. That's in a way the kind of primordial notion, economic notion that comes from investing someone with significance or trust. You expect them to have integrity. What I'm calling credit B is purchasing on credit. It's accepting a deferred payment for some kind of good or service provided. Closely related to that is credit C, which is not giving credit so much as the question. These words get slippery because it's a question of who's doing the crediting in which case, and we use it in all these different senses because we assume we know who's giving credit. But an advance of money in exchange for an obligation or debt. So your credit card company pays on your behalf if you pay by credit card, but then you have an obligation or debt to the credit card company. So there's that sense of credit. And finally, credit is also used in bookkeeping as something is credited to an account. It's written in a certain column, and opposite it is written a debit. So credit and debt often seem to be the same thing. In economic senses, normally the relationship between credit and debt is reciprocal. That a credit will involve a debt and a debt will involve a credit. The two things go together. Now, you asked about how this economic sense relates to religious senses, and I'm going to, from the standard, New Revised Standard translation, offer you a famous instance of the use of the word credit, which is used to translate charis, normally translated grace, in Jesus saying, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And it goes on and on. You probably know the passage well. And there's all sorts of paradoxes that that emerge from this. Your reward, that seems to be a reciprocal compensation, a wage, will be great, and you'll be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. This is one of the problematic passages from the Gospels where the basis of human society in reciprocity and mutual participation seems to be called into question. And I tend to think that the sayings of Jesus are best understood as problems, that he's setting problems. He's not necessarily giving us answers. He's setting us problems to think about. Where is investment, in the sense of my original definition here, giving someone credit, investing something with significance and trust, where is it different to the economic senses involving reciprocity? Now, obviously, the definition I gave of credit is one instance, but there are all sorts of other instances or aspects of life of things that you can give but are not reciprocal. Forgiveness, to say to someone, I'll forgive you if you forgive me, that's not forgiving them, is it? Forgiveness is somehow non-reciprocal. But then more obvious things, attention can be reciprocal, but it can be you just give attention. Whether you get it back is neither here nor there. Giving someone care, giving someone love. These things can be thought reciprocally. But when we come on to life, we don't give someone life and expect life back in return. And likewise with time, this is the strange one, because that would seem to be, you can give someone time, they can give time to you. We share our time, we're sharing our time in this conversation. But the nature of time is such that it's given to us, we have a certain amount of time. And we only have that time insofar as we spend it. We can spend it on ourselves, we can spend it on other people, we can do anything with it, but we have to spend it in order to have it. So I call these things goods of offering, in that they're not like economic goods or services that you can consume. They're things that we only have insofar as we spend them or give them away. Trust is like that too. So this is the relationship between credit as something that's positive, that's existential, that's a real definite part of life, and credit that's usually understood in economic terms is the converse of debt. A debt is the, have I got a definition here? No, I've got a definition of faith. Debt is a promise to provide a particular good or service or money at a certain time of a certain amount. So it's quite well defined, whereas giving time need not be defined like that. Giving care, giving attention, giving credit need not be defined in those sorts of ways. So they're quite different things the more you think about them. And then one only has to point out that actually the most basic, deepest truth about human experience is that our lives are made up of these existential goods. This is what makes us into who we are. And suddenly we've got an answer to the problem that Jesus sets. Suddenly we've got a way of interpreting reality that tends to get obscured beneath economic conceptions and other conceptions. And just to link credit and faith, I've got a working definition of faith. To have faith is to live, which now I'm suggesting is a matter of distributing time, care, attention, forgiveness, credit, those sorts of things. That's what it is to live, in accordance with some pre-existent investment of someone or something with significance and or trust. So to have faith is, in a way, to recognize these things really are significant, or these people really are trustworthy. These people have been rightly been given credit in some sense in the past. So it's the old-fashioned sense of religion as retracing what has been given before, as repeating, is this conception of faith that would go along with that kind of conception of credit. It's not that we completely invent from scratch what matters to us. No, when we give credit, we're actually retracing a significance that we believe is already there, or trustworthiness that we believe is already there. Let's stop sharing my screen.
That's really interesting, that sense of credit being something which connects us with the past, but also obviously points us towards the future as well. And I mean, I wonder if you could just expand a bit more on that, Philip, thinking about sort of the history then really of the idea of credit, how that's evolved, how it how did the specifically economic understanding of credit and of debt that we've ended up with now, how did that come about exactly, looking back at the backstory there?
It's a very long backstory, and I'm going to relate it to money.
Okay.
That you can have a sense of credit without really a money economy, and you can have people, you have whole societies that operate without money because they're local, they trust each other, they invest each other with credit, they cooperate. But the loss in that original sense of credit or trust happens when a money economy comes along, but not merely a money economy. Some quite specific conditions. So if I share my screen again, go back to the PowerPoint. If we're going to cooperate with each other, if we're going to produce things, if we're going to transform the world in some sense, I think there's perhaps three broad ways in which this has been done. You can have this great idea of what you take is really significant or what's really trustworthy. You propose it, you give it credit, someone else has faith in your idea, and you cooperate, and huge things can happen if we work together. Now, this, I would say, is probably a way of interpreting how world religions have worked. They've spread because They are issuing a certain kind of credit, and people have faith in that. And this has been enormously transformative of the world in a certain kind of way. But there's another way of transforming the world when people don't trust each other and don't share the same vision, and that is coercion. And of course, in the whole of the modern world, there's been all sorts of attempts to either by threat of the use of arms, force, or by actually using force, or by instituting taxation or poll taxes or corvée labor, or depriving people of some essential means of subsistence, such as salt, to preserve their food. There are all sorts of forms of coercion that can get people to cooperate, and that can transform the world. But rather more peaceful than that is money. Money is the interesting one, because all three of these have made the world that we now live in, but money is the one that's more complex for how it affects credit and faith. So a few kind of observations on money. Money is an object of trust. We trust that money holds its value. We can't kind of prove it. We can't weigh it or demonstrate it. Try and weigh it. That doesn't really prove its value. What we do is we trust that others will trust its value. So it's a kind of collective participatory process that we think that money has value, or we don't have to think it. We just have to act as it is. But in itself, it's merely just a symbol. It can be a piece of paper, it can be a figure in a bank account. It's just a symbol. It's a symbol, if it's got a sovereign's head on it, it's a symbol of sovereign power, of the trustworthiness of that sovereign or that nation or its economic power. Or it can, in some sense, symbolize the sovereignty of the purchaser or consumer who makes their own choices freely and can do what they want from with their own money. So whereas the original sense I gave you of credit and faith is highly contextual, it takes place in relation to definite people or in relation to definite things, money is largely detachable from any initial context in which it's created or issued, in which it symbolizes the originary notion of credit. And because of that, because it's detachable, it can be hoarded. It can be an object of desire. We can desire money. And like things like power, fame, and pleasure, because we can appropriate this symbol that gives us power over other people and makes people do what we want, it facilitates a kind of egoism that wouldn't be possible without it. So it's a transferable credit instrument. And what's really puzzling about money is it's incredibly productive. If you've got money, you can get almost anything done that involves cooperation. And you might say the real power of that is cooperation, but cooperation doesn't happen unless you've got a common vision, credit and faith, or you've got coercion, or you've got something like money, which goes between the two. So this is why money is really interesting. And the reason why is you don't have to share in that vision. You don't have to trust the people you're dealing with. You don't have to know them. You don't have to ask about their reputation if they're simply paying money. Because you trust the money you recognize, you know the money. If it's some strange currency you've never seen before, you might not trust it. But if it's pound sterling or dollars, it's going to look quite familiar, or euros. So money actually exists as a solution to how you extend trust, cooperation, and reciprocity beyond our immediate relationships, beyond our shared visions. So it somehow it gets further where religion, which of course religions have become world religions, and they have initiated trusting relationships between complete strangers, but they can't quite get people to cooperate if they don't share the same common vision. Money exists as that kind of solution. So it's really valuable, but in that sense, it's a solution to the problem of distrust. And if we distrust each other, then money is going to be really helpful to get what we want done. And though there's this tendency to hoard money. And as there's a tendency to hoard money, there's never enough money for all that needs to be done. And perhaps if we had this tendency to spend money as quickly as possible because it was quickly losing value, then perhaps we get a lot more done. But as it is, we have this tendency to hoard or invest money. And this is the way, the experience of a society formed around trade and market exchange. And I'm thinking specifically of England in the 16th and 17th centuries. So ask me about history. I'm going to say a little bit about that the society in that time period. It was a growing economy because there was a lot of exports of wool, and there were towns and cities were growing. Craftspeople were setting up shops or in the towns, and there was a whole network of transactions. But the coinage used to facilitate them tended to be hoarded by the big merchants because they needed it for important transactions, or by individuals who think, oh, I've got my taxes coming up, I better save enough money to pay my taxes. So there's never enough money to go around. And the money that was in circulation was getting, it was hardly renewed much during the 16th, 17th centuries. It was getting very worn out. It was getting clipped. People thought, oh, that's not going to be worth anything. They might not accept the coinage. So instead, you have an economy that starts to be based on deferred payment. And this, I'm going to suggest, was very obvious then. It's the same now, but it's hidden now. It's sort of under the covers now. And it's that transformation that I think is absolutely crucial for seeing the way in which credit works in our society. So let's start with a network of transactions. I can't pay you now, I'll pay you later because so-and-so owes me this, and so-and-so owes them that, and eventually they'll pay them, and then I can pay you. That kind of network means that everyone's mutually dependent. It also means that if you can find ways of tying up the network, A owes B, B owes C, C owes A, you can just cancel out the debts. You can reckon them. You can all get together. You can have a village meeting in the pub and talk about your debts and who owes what to whom, and say, well, let's call this one quits and let's cancel this one. And you don't even need any money to facilitate the transactions. You just need it as a unit of account, really. Say, oh, I owe so much money so that you can call it even. Now, in this society, the people you're going to do business with are the people with the most credit worthiness, the greatest integrity. And in a Puritan society, and it was Puritan because of this economy, I suggest, what the people you trust are those you see in church, those you see up early in the morning getting on with their business so that they can afford to pay their obligations, and those who aren't wasting their money down the pub. Piety, diligence, and thrift. In this society, your wealth is not how much money you've got in the bank, and it's not even how many goods you've got in your shop. Your actual wealth is your social standing. There's no difference between wealth and social standing. If people think you're credit worthy, then and have a good opinion of you, they will do business with you. They will lend to you. They will provide goods and services or even money on credit, expecting you'll be easily capable of meeting your obligations, and you will be capable because if you don't have the money when the time comes, you can borrow it from someone else. So it's this weird economy in which the trusted are immensely trusted, but the people who are not trusted, who are not quite so pious or diligent or thrifty, or have never been trusted in the first place, they don't really get a look in. So it's a strange society where everyone is incredibly interested in everyone else's business because it deeply affects everyone else and the whole state of society. There's even a sense of public credit. How willing are people to interact, to engage in deferred payment, to accept deferred payment, it all depends on how healthy the society is, how much integrity there is in general. In this context, litigation is going to court as a last resort, and yet, of course, the whole system was falling apart, creaking at the hinges. There was one year, I think it might have been 1583, where there were about 1 million court cases filed for unpaid debts. That's about one for every household in the country at the time. It's a crazy system. It's really not attractive. And within this economy, it lurches from crisis to crisis. But what's essential to it is that people should be decent. That is, that they should be pious, they should be trustworthy, they should be Puritan. It needn't matter if they're Quakers, so long as they're not Catholics, was the attitude in the 17th century. And so in order to preserve trust, which is to preserve society as a whole, you had to make war on your neighbors to defend against them imposing an entirely foreign religion. And at the time, there's a huge suspicion of atheism undermining all basis of trust. Likewise, a suspicion of other countries taking over. As a result of this warfare, the national debt by the 1690s grew so large it was entirely unpayable and threatened to bring down the whole economy in a way that made the 2007 May crash look extremely minor. We had good ways of dealing with 2007 May. They had to invent entirely new things in those days. What was the solution? The solution is finance capitalism. I think of capitalism, or what we call capitalism, as essentially debt-based or finance capitalism. What did they do? They founded the Bank of England. They made the debt permanent, the national debt permanent. They monetized it. That means that they didn't have enough cash in circulation, so they gave permission to the Bank of England to print its own £20 notes. And people knew they had value because the government would have to pay up with its taxes. It would be permanently paying back money to the Bank of England. So the Bank of England would always be able to meet its obligations. And of course, the amounts didn't have to, you could print as much money as you needed to circulate. You didn't have, because these notes circulated. They were never brought back to the Bank of England to be paid off in gold. And so you get this sudden change from a society that's oriented primarily around deferred payment to one where at last you can pay with cash again, but bank notes rather than coins. And you much prefer a banknote from the Bank of England because you think it's much more likely to hold its value than some promissory note written by Joe Bloggs on the corner.
So what you're saying there, Philip, just to butt in, if I may, the banknotes that we still use today, they say on them, the chief cashier of the Bank of England says, "I promise to pay on demand the sum of £10 or whatever." That actually has gone all the way back to the 1690s when the Bank of England was formed. And it is essentially an IOU, which the government is issuing through the Bank of England. It's a credit note in effect. But it's impersonal in the sense that it can move around in society rather than simply being an arrangement between you and me, whereby I owe you some money or whatever.
Yes, there are much older examples of it, but the thing about a national central bank, even though it's a private bank, when it was founded, is that the notes can circulate, and because its solvency is trusted, unlike lots of American banks in the 19th century, because it's trusted, people don't try to redeem their promise. And if you go to the cashier at the Bank of England and say, "Can I have my £20, please?" they'll give you another note instead, one of their other notes. Or if you insist, all right, they'd have a little stock of foreign currency and give you a foreign currency from a different bank instead, if you prefer that.
Sure.
So they're all promises, they're all credit notes. And this is why I say the economy runs essentially on credit, because a banknote is a credit note.
Mm.
But of course, it doesn't actually, when it's written by the Bank of England, it doesn't decide exactly what has significance or what has creditworthiness, but it can only work within a context of a special relationship between the Bank of England, the government treasury, which is a separate organization, and then all the clearing banks like HSBC and NatWest and Barclays and Lloyds, the bank with the central bank, so that when they have debts to exchange between them, they just transfer, they cancel nearly everything out, like in the village pub. And they say, okay, overnight tonight, I owe you a bit more, so I'll pay you the overnight interest rate. And so you don't, in a way, it's a system without cash. It's a system of pure promises.
Yeah. Which
And
I guess is a very positive thing, gives it tremendous flexibility and capacity
yes.
for expansion, but potentially it makes it very fragile as well under certain circumstances.
Oh, absolutely, under certain circumstances, yes. I think the one point that I really wanted to make, which is on this slide, is that it produces a massive change in people's attitudes towards themselves, towards each other. Because now, instead of taking an interest in everyone else's life, making sure everyone is pious and upright and diligent or condemned for being lazy and poor, now the only thing you need to do is make sure you get hold of enough money to pay your debts. That is, get hold of enough banknotes. So instead of your wealth being what everyone else sees it, thinks of you, now it's only what your bank thinks of you. In other words, what it says in your bank account. So the pursuit of self-interest, in other words, the pursuit of money, whatever form it takes, whether it's banknotes or figures in your bank account, is the best way of embodying that person of integrity, of creditworthiness, who keeps society afloat by means of their trustworthiness. And this means in the previous situation, it's kind of unlimited. You had to do as much as possible. You had to take an interest in everyone. Now we've got two moral spheres. You've got the obligation, I must pay my debts, now conceived primarily in terms of monetary debts. Once you've done that, you've done your bit, then you're free. You're free from your debts. So I call it, it's a sphere of redemption in a sense. I've paid my debts now. I've paid off my mortgage. I've got a pension saved up. I can retire. I'm entirely free from all those obligations. I can now do what I think is important in life, or I can do what I want with my own money. And what I would suggest is that this obligation, I must pay my debts in the form of money and therefore get money, or this sense, I paid my debts, I'm free now, both substitute for that older construction of society around religion, understood as credit and faith. So in the 17th century, there was quite a lot of fear of atheism, condemnation of atheism. There was no atheists. It was just utterly inconceivable that you wouldn't live according to credit and faith. But very quickly in a monetary economy, you don't need that anymore because you can just rely on money, the money system as your credit system. So that's one of the big changes is secularization. Right.
Well, that's interesting. So that's fascinating, the way you've kind of woven a narrative for us there, connecting up the way in which the different meanings of credit and the way that's evolved over the course of time, and the way in which things have become, with the advent of a central bank, become impersonal, and that's changed the sort of almost the fabric of our relationships as society. That's why, I mean, bringing this kind of up to date a bit now, Philip. I mean, where does that leave the idea of credit today? I mean, the kind of financial system that you've just outlined for us, it's been in existence now for 300 years or more, I guess. But we seem, certainly over the last, shall we say, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years, we seem to have managed to build up absolutely gigantic amounts of debt in the system, and most particularly, I suppose we've been aware of this since 2008. So where does that leave credit and debt? What's the future, I suppose, of credit and debt, I guess I'm asking, and is there a particular kind of Christian slant on that?
The way I see it is that our system is based, it was designed as a crisis stopgap. Yeah, the whole country was falling apart. The whole economic system was falling apart. In 1696, they thought the coinage is worthless. We need to call it all back in. They called back in £6 million worth of silver and reminted it into good, true coins that everyone would trust, and found they only had 4 million. Yes. But the government debt was already well over 6 million anyway by that stage, and next decade it was quickly getting up to 13 million or whatever. So you had this absolute crisis situation, and therefore I think that what we've brought in is a situation that's a kind of a desperate stopgap, but it's prone to creating further crises. And in a sense, the 2007 to 8 crisis started to reveal what's at the core of the system. It started to reveal that the world isn't quite as we take it to be. So part of this image that emerges of the self-interested individual who operates in the market and therefore engages in reciprocal relations that provide a public service to everyone, that kind of image is a partial truth about the way the economy works, but it's not the whole story, because the whole story includes this other bit that was missing, which is we can only exchange at all because there's a central bank with banknotes, and that's connected to the international other central banks, the Bank of International Settlements. It's connected to the government treasury, which holds the national debt. And the national debt is the kind of most reliable, secure form of investment, but it also is intimately linked to the power of the government to raise taxes and so to pay up on its debt. So there's this relationship between the Bank of England and the Treasury, which was accessed very much in normally forbidden and counterintuitive ways during pandemic, when we could switch off whole sections of the economy but still keep things going, because and the government spending enormously because it's suddenly given money by the central bank, which I call the debtor of last resort as opposed to the lender of last resort, because it doesn't have any money. It's only got its reputation. It's only got its relationship with other banks.
So if it carries on just printing money which has no basis in real wealth, then surely that's going to impact on its reputation eventually, and the whole system begins to wobble, doesn't it?
That's what inflation is, and that's why it's been raising interest rates. Inflation is money losing its value, us not trusting it anymore.
Right.
Now, it can have totally different causes, which I think it has it has gotten, like energy prices going up. We haven't got enough gas, that's why. And we haven't got enough skilled labor. That's why inflation is going up. But inflation is the value of money relative to goods and services, but it's also a measure of trust in money. And so to restrict the amount of lending, to restrict the amount of newly created cash in the economy, because it's not just created by the central banks, it's every time people take out a loan, that's a kind of creation of money because it gets cancelled out by the clearing banks and their relationship with each other. So the system can be controlled a bit through levers the central bank has, such as interest rates, such as quantitative easing, such as its announcements of what it might do that then made speculators to think and behave accordingly, etc., etc. There's various limited levers that it can pull, and it can keep the whole thing relatively stable for a while. So it is a kind of big insurance policy. So the question would be the national debt. I mentioned the figure of 6 million back in, well, it was 1.2 million when the Bank of England was founded. That was the original loan. So how has it expanded to, I don't know what the figure is now, but it's billions and billions in 300 years. It's on the one hand, it's really sustainable that it can keep going on and on, because it's just a symbol of relationships of trust. If you keep the relationships of trust firmly in place, then we can go on as we are. So what are the limits? There's one limit, which is about people's belief in the system. The system works because we don't understand it. We believe it works. If we properly understood it, we might stop believing in it. Yeah, it's more complicated than that, of course. We still have to trust it, even if we do understand it. What we think and how we behave are two totally different things in this strange economic world. But there is this relationship of trust between a government and its people. If government can pay for people to be on furlough during a pandemic, why can't it pay for people to be on furlough or have a citizen's income throughout the rest of the year? I mean, throughout a whole decade or a couple of decades. Why can't the Bank of England just print money? Now, one fear is there's too much money around in the form of inflation. But the other side of that is there's not enough work being done. And that is perhaps one of the truths of the current economy, that there are people who get to a moderate stage of wealth. I'm sorry, I'm not going to sound so pointing finger at anyone here. I may well
take it personally.
I'm intending to retire early, but not especially early. But people who could work but who stop working because they've got enough means. That means they still use goods and services, so they rely on everyone else to work for them. They've got their pensions, their investments, they're fine. But if everyone were to start doing that because they rely on the government printing money, then you don't have any work being done. And so there's that basis for trust and cooperation is completely vanished. So in a sense, you have to maintain these fictions of, not that I would endorse the austerity policies of the past decade, but something a bit like that has to be maintained, that we've got this terrible debt to the future. It's immoral to leave these enormous debts to future generations to have to pay. They're going to have to pay much higher taxes than us. So these are fictions because the debt can keep on going, but they're necessary fictions because otherwise we wouldn't be working. So that's one limit. The other limit that I could talk about quickly is a bit more technical. It's about the overall level of debt in the system. Now, it's from one perspective, a debt is just a contract. It's a matter of how much trust there is, how much agreement there is in an economic system. A system with loads of debts is the one where there's loads of ongoing economic contracts. So that, again, is fine. It can keep on expanding. But there comes a point, and it's a bit similar to the previous one, where businesses and individuals and governments and local governments and all sorts of organizations are loaded by such a level of debt service that a little bit of growth in the economy gets completely absorbed by how much they have to pay back the debt. And there's an Australian economist, Steve Keen, who's come to this estimate of when the debt is about the overall debt in an economy, not the national debt, this is the corporations and individual debt. When that gets to about 150% of GDP, then you get an economy that starts to flatline, like in the case of Japan over the past 3 decades, and to a certain extent, Western economies since 2009.
So this is the great stagnation.
Great, yes. So if we overdo it, then we can't grow ourselves out of the situation. unless we have to have this massive investment. In a way, we only recovered from the Great Depression because of the Second World War,
Oh, yes.
because it's massive amount of government spending, then boosted, because everything the government creates and spends, it then is given to someone to provide some good or service. They then can spend in it, and it goes round and round and round and round, eventually gets taxed back. It's very hard to find the figures on this, but once I saw a Freedom of Information request to government estimate that 96% of government spending immediately comes back in for taxation.
Very right.
Because there's so many transactions that it goes through. And then there's this little bit of leakage that goes out of the economy.
Oh, how fascinating.
Yeah, a bit of a limit.
Right. Philip, we've got a lot of questions coming in here, which so was there anything else you wanted to just say to round off that piece, or can I begin to shoot one or two of these at you?
Yeah, let's go for the questions, because otherwise I will talk indefinitely and I won't address them.
Which will be fine, which would be great. Okay, so I mean, one of the questions that's come up, which has just caught my eye there, you've kind of touched on it already, and it's from Kat, and she asks, and maybe you could expand on what this term means. And she asks, how does modern monetary theory interact with what you've said, the view that the government can create its own fiat money without any consequences? So, I mean, could you just say a quick word about modern money theory and why that's suddenly become very popular amongst even quite mainstream economists in the last 10 years?
Yeah. Modern monetary theory is something that's come out of the University of, I can't remember, some small American state, which I hear this phrase in two senses. There's a phrase in popular discourse that is a kind of caricature of Keynesianism, that the government can spend whatever it wants.
Yeah.
But then there's actually what the monetary theorists say about the nature of the nature of the architecture of the economy. And basically, they are right in a way that the mainstream economists were wrong. That the mainstream economists have just borrowed textbooks that were written in the 19th century about American banks then, and they just don't understand monetary creation and the nature of money and how it works. And it's the modern monetary theorists that do. So I've learned a lot from them. I've developed my thought in conversation with reading their work. But where I would differ, there's this primer written by Randall Ray, which quotes Paul Samuelson, that famous American economist from the mid-20th century, kind of the big Keynesian figure. When Ray is arguing, look, it's just a fiction. He quotes Samuelson saying, yeah, we've got to maintain this pretense. But the pretense that Samuelson is talking about is that the government can't print and spend money. But Samuelson understands, and I don't think Ray quite gets it, that the reason you can't is a moral reason, not an economic reason. It's that idea that everyone wants something for nothing and will lose complete faith in money and lose faith in the government if you print too much money. That's what the point that Samuelson is making, and that's where I disagree with them. That you can print your way out of a crisis like a pandemic, but you're not going to be able to solve all sorts of problems.
Yeah. So that kind of connects up with the point you were making about the evolution of the modern sense of credit in the late 17th century, where something which was very much a kind of moral bond between people who knew each other suddenly became impersonal and became purely economic and instrumental in that sense. There's a bit of
although what I'd want to say is that moral bond is still there. It's not there in the wider economy. We experience it as some kind of objective, impersonal thing.
Yeah.
But between the privileged institutions, there are still all the old-fashioned moral checks and balances. You have to be a director of a major financial corporation in the UK. you have to be approved, personally approved by the Bank of England as a right and proper person who is going to
Yes.
conduct your business honestly. And that's the old-fashioned notion of creditworthiness, that it's there. And it's these really close relationships between just a few institutions that are the old credit relationships that I was talking about there in the 17th century, that are secretly there as the basis of the current supposedly impersonal economy.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me just bring in one or two more questions here then. So Alan's asking, how moral is national indebtedness? I can't quite make sense of that sentence. To better the present. Yes. How moral is national indebtedness to improve our current situation? I think that means, bearing in mind the repayments, but will have to be made by future generations. So, but are we framing that correctly, Philip? Or, I mean, again, I almost picked up from some of the things you were saying, that the debts we're building up, actually, with a bit of luck, nobody need ever have to repay them.
Yeah, that's right. So they need not be repaid, but the interest rates will rise. So the amount you're paying on interest will rise.
Right.
Now that then becomes a kind of circulation of money from the people who are being taxed to the people who hold the bonds.
Right.
And sometimes they're the same people, sometimes they're not.
Right.
So it's actually a kind of an unequal funneling of money. So in itself, it's not especially a kind of moral or indifferent thing. There is a moral downside to it.
Right.
But beyond that, there's the wider issue. If we're talking about it being immoral to pass on this debt to future generations, there's also a question of what we pass on to future generations in the way of a working health service, in the way of an economy that's adapted to ecological crisis. It's immoral to pass on a state of complete ignorance and unpreparedness to a generation that are going to have to deal with the consequences of our own behavior.
Yeah.
So on that basis, there are monetary debts, but there are also passing on creating a mess, which is also immoral, and the two are balanced against each other.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. So again, the legacy that we leave future generations can take many different forms, can't it? From our point of view. Here's another question: maybe the things like the Jubilee 2000 campaign are in the background of this question. Are campaigns to forgive national debts examples of Christian mercy, or do they actually end up undermining the international economic system?
Quickly, I'd say Christian mercy. In the bigger issue is about a lot of, if we're talking about the Jubilee 2000 campaign, we're talking about debts that were contracted by sovereign governments without really the knowledge and permission of their people. Often, not always, they were wasted or appropriated by by people. Not always, but then to hold a people to account because of its government's behavior is something that, on the one hand, is quite immoral, but beyond that, it's something that ultimately is unworkable.
Okay. And
the nature of a debt economy, this is made clear by one of the original modern monetary theorists, Michael Hudson, who did a lot of research on the ancient Babylonian economy, is the whole thing would keep collapsing because of excessive debts. People get into too much debt. Farmers would flee to the hills and become bandits, and then the whole society would collapse. So a new king would come into power, and their immediate thing was to declare all debts forgiven. And so the Jubilee thing, it goes back in history. It's it's there long before the Hebrew Bible was written. And in fact, the Rosetta Stone, the one piece through which we've been able to first translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, is an announcement from 200 BC of a jubilee.
Wow.
So the only way to actually keep an economy working is to forgive some debts, because otherwise they're just going to grow out of all proportion. You can't hold them in. They're not going to stay in any other way. So at some point, you have to decide to forgive some debts in some respect. Of course, if you simply do that, and in a sense, inflation, debt forgiveness, debt default amount to much the same thing. They can threaten to undermine the system. So they have to be done in a controlled way.
Yeah, I was going to say on the back of that, presumably when debts are forgiven, there are obviously winners, those who are in debt, but also losers too. And I guess in a modern credit economy where people's debts have been parceled up and sold from person to person, and they serve as they've become assets effectively. If suddenly those assets disappear because that debt has been waived, then those who are relying on those assets to generate income for themselves suddenly find themselves high and dry.
Exactly. But here there's a massive difference between a developed economy where the government bonds are treated as an enormously reliable and safe investment, and you don't get governments defaulting, however indebted they become, as compared to developing economies where there isn't the same sort of willingness to invest in their treasury bonds anyway, and they're regarded as high risk, and you have to pay a higher rate of interest anyway. And it's a totally different system. Totally different persons are involved in these different means who'll be affected in different ways by debt default, debt cancellation.
Changing tack here slightly, there's a question from Mark, and again, it would be helpful for you to unpack some of the basic terminology here. He asks, how would a degrowth economy change things? Could you kind of sketch what this idea of degrowth means, perhaps, as a kickoff, and then reflect on the question? How would that change things?
The notion of a degrowth economy has, I'm not going to give a full final definition of what it is, because I'm not quite up to date on it all. But the basic idea is we've got ecological limits to economic growth. Basically, if we have economic growth, that means more money going into the pockets of consumers. That means more things being spent. And it doesn't matter if we all go online and stop dealing with material goods, because we're still dealing with material goods of huge servers in basements and cellars on underground mines, and all the mining to produce our laptops, etc., etc. There's the economy then is necessarily, and I believe this for nearly 40 years now, is necessarily in a collision course with with ecology, which is, we live on a limited planet. So the notion of a degrowth economy is going back to the classical economists who thought that growth was an exceptional thing, but largely we had a steady state, and that's what the economy would tend towards. But if you read Adam Smith, you find the steady state is pretty miserable and depressing, because wages get depressed, and then infant mortality rises, and that's what keeps a check on the population. And he doesn't like that a bit. But a degrowth economy would be at least designed to reduce our consumption, for us to do more with less and less, and hopefully lead less materialistic and much more fulfilled and richer and wealthier lives, in a sense. All this, I think, is wonderful and necessary, but also impossible.
Why so?
There's a way of achieving it, and it's called, there's two. One's called war, the other's called, several. It's called depression, and that in pandemics as well. They're all pretty awful things. The reason is that all economic activity, as it's currently constituted, all credit, all lending, is based on the pursuit of profit. Right. And profits can only come in the economy as a whole if it keeps growing. So instead of having a market economy, which is perfectly adapted to a steady state, what we have is nothing like a market economy. It's embedded in a market economy, but it's something totally different. That in order to pay back your debt with a little bit of interest, the only place that money is going to come from for you to pay it back is someone else taking out a debt with the interest already in there. So they have the obligation. So we're actually just swapped between us our obligations to engage in more and more economic activity, primarily to pay our debts back, not just to earn a living or to get rich and famous or powerful or live luxurious lifestyles. Most of us, I mean, yes, a lot of people do, but the ultimate mechanism underlying here is a mechanism that's utterly unstable, that's not in equilibrium, that is aiming towards growth. And so if we all decide, okay, let's work less, let's pay off our debts and then not take any more out, let's borrow less. If we stop borrowing, the capitalist system is a bubble, essentially. And the moment we stop inflating it, it's going to collapse. Now, of course, it can collapse, and then we start growing the same kind of bubble again as before. But it doesn't really solve our problem. So that's what I'm utter pessimist. I'm sorry about this, but I think.
So but that's interesting, because what I was going to say to you, does that therefore mean, Philip, that we're doomed one way or the other, and it's a case of which way the bubble pops, really, and how we seek to rebuild after that?
It does, but I've worried. I've worried for years and years about this, and the best solution that I can come to is actually a complete change in perspective. That there's something about, and if I share my screen again, I'll try not to ramble on too long about this, but I just want to say something about. There's something about the monetary economy that makes us live in this world of complete illusions. It's as though we're living in Plato's cave. That's that we live this life of complete contradictions, that we can't make sense of ourselves, we can't make sense of society around us, because we view everything in the light of money. Money becomes the most important thing to determine the reality of things, to determine what things are worth, to determine how we're going to trust each other. The whole basis of society are formed in a capitalist debt economy, growth economy around money. And the whole thing is full of illusions, such as, let's skip that one, but we've got autonomy within the law, but on the other hand, we're completely at the mercy of the economy not collapsing. We've got these urgent priorities, but we can hardly act on them at all. Even as individuals, we know certain things that really matter to us, but we prefer to spend a lot of our lives being distracted or simply doing what's expected of us. We've got a supposedly wealthy economy, and so many people are living on food banks. We live these totally irrational lives that we don't understand. And this is because our whole way of seeing reality in terms of projects, in terms of goals, in terms of certain kind of achievements, in terms of personal success, in terms of possessions, in terms of individual freedom, all of this is a completely skewed perspective. I'm not, because I don't want to go on too long. So I think if we were just to go back to our existential goods and say, this is what makes life real. This is the reality of life, not how much, not the monetary value of things. It's back to my original definition. Giving credit is to invest someone or something with significance or trust. If we then see the problem of trust as the heart of society,
Hmm.
and the monetary system as a way of regulating and extending and facilitating that, that's made enormous transformations and enormous achievements, but is also completely ambivalent in that it's going to hit a limit and it's going to crash.
Hmm.
Then we need to rebuild our relationships from the ground up, and that ground is credit.
Wow.
So ultimately, I think we need to completely change the way we see life as well as then relate to each other. On the one hand, we do need our extended relationships with strangers. We need to trust them, and money and auditing and accounting, all the regulations and all the institutions of accountability facilitate that. But somehow we've got to start to invent other institutions that extend credit, extend it as trust, without detaching it from all significance or all trustworthiness. And now that sounds very abstract problem, but I really do think we're in this crazy, that capitalism itself is like the South Sea bubble. It's this incredible speculative bubble. It's completely transformed the landscape in a way that it cannot sustain.
Yeah.
And the fallout over the next 2 decades, sorry, I said this 2 decades ago, and we've only seen a bit of the fallout. It was being able to survive a lot longer than I thought.
Rumors of capitalism's death are always premature, aren't they?
Yeah, yes. And when it
I,
does die, it'll probably be reborn. But the larger process of the death is that capitalism becomes a more and more hollowed out system that just applies to certain wealthy and powerful individuals, and the middle classes will soon be the kind of the prey who get pushed back into the classes who are struggling on the edge of existence. And of course that's been going on for quite some time with things like student loans and
a lot of people, I mean, we haven't got time to get into this now, but a lot of people I'm reading at the moment are talking about the emergence of a kind of a post-capitalist neo-feudalism, or techno-feudalism is sometimes called, which seems to embrace that sense of, increasingly only a tiny elite at the top are actually going to really own things in the future, and therefore, exercise the power that goes with that. And increasingly, the rest of us will simply be clients of those serfs, in the older language. Can I ask you one time possibly for just one more question? And it's caught my eye. It's from Gaynor, and I think this is quite interesting because again it ties in with this whole question of how trust operates. And she just simply asks how about investing in gold? I mean, there were times, weren't there, when your hard currency was all you had before the Bank of England came along and so forth. And I'll share with you a little personal note. I actually have purchased some gold just recently because of some American investment advisors I've been watching on YouTube. So have I done a wise thing, Philip, or have I put my faith in the wrong place?
Well, I remember American investment advisors saying this back in 2006. The crash is coming. You need to invest in gold. I didn't.
Oh,
gold
I'm
did go up in
encouraged.
value. There's one advisor who tends to be right on most things, who has said you will have gold going. It's about, I don't know, it's about $1,800, and now at the moment it'll go up to 3,000. He says. So, if the short answer is, if you're worried about yourself, this may not be catastrophic investment to make at the moment. But on the other hand, how about investing in Bitcoin? How about investing in Scottish whiskey? These are things that only hold value insofar as there's demand for them. They're kind of completely detached from any use value. And gold is a bit like that. Of course, yeah, there's a demand for gold jewelry, which is separate, which is linked to, but it's separate from the demand for gold for investment. But the fact that this piece of metal is seen to hold value is such a subjective outcome of a social process of collecting valuing that is a bit like a market system that can switch just like that, in the way that we've seen the cryptocurrencies, which embody this in the pure state, how they
Yeah.
fluctuate wildly in value. They go up and down, and you know, don't go near cryptocurrencies is my advice.
Yeah, that's Philip's hot tip for us all this evening, folks. Don't go anywhere near crypto, particularly if, I mean, we've got literally 3 minutes to go, but quick word about the possible advent of central bank digital currencies, Philip. What's that going to do to ordinary life, if anything?
Yeah, this is something that's been floated since I did my work, and I haven't followed it as closely as, I mean, I've seen the consultations come round, but I haven't really thought it through hard. It seems to be a kind of a pushback against the cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
But also it is a move in the direction of what the positive money people, who was another branch of the modern monetary theory, who understand, get the economic system right. But it's about recreating something a bit more like a market economy, where instead of relying on all sorts of central banks and financial institutions, we all be equal in that we all have a bank account with the Bank of England. Now, it used to be the case that only 163 institutions, not so long ago, I can't remember which day, perhaps 2011, there were 163 institutions allowed to have accounts with a central bank. The central bank currency is not really very different to the notes. It's just suddenly there's a much wider group of individuals, and it might not be the same as all citizens. There are all sorts of complicated issues about who counts as a citizen or who qualifies for a bank account at the central bank. But there will be an economy that cuts out the potentially that cuts out the NatWests and all these middle people. Does that matter? Does that make a big difference? I don't think it makes a huge difference to anything. My guess is that it fiddles with the architecture, but it actually largely the same architecture is in place. It might seem that it pushes it further away from those old personal relationships of trust, in that suddenly everyone is dealing as just exchanging their reserve accounts at the Bank of England instead of their notes and coins. But I think it's not going to change. That will make some changes, and I can't quite work out exactly what they'll be, but I don't think it will be enormously significant. Okay. But I might be wrong about that.
Yes.
I don't think it's going to solve any of our problems about capitalism.
No, but it might present us with some interesting new problems to have to deal with. Can I just thank you, Philip? Just quick plug to put in there on the back of that is that we're currently on the Join Enough Enabling Group. We're planning a in-person conference. Don't know if you remember those from the good old days, in October this year, and we're very keen to set a theme which really take stock of where we are now in terms of the last couple of years or so. And so questions about where is the economy, where is the financial world going, and how does that impinge on the created order and on Christian faith are going to be at the heart of that. So we'll certainly be coming back to some of these themes then, I think. Well, according to my timepiece, it's the allotted hour of 8:15, Philip. So I think we're going to need to draw stumps at this point. So can I simply, on behalf of all of us, say thank you ever so much for giving us that good of offering, which is your time this evening. We really appreciate that. And you've led us on a journey through many fascinating bits of terrain. We've learned all kinds of things in the process that we didn't know before, and I think you've helped us formulate our questions in new ways. I've certainly been helped through listening to you and through reading your books to make connections between some of the sort of the everyday language we use in church with the stuff that otherwise would inhabit a different universe of discourse, all the stuff to do with economics and money. So it's as we continue to make connections between those two ostensibly different worlds, I think that we as Christians have a chance to make some kind of a contribution here. And particularly if things go pear-shaped economically sooner or later, that strikes me as more than anything else a significant missiological challenge for the church. What does it mean for us as church to again offer a place where people can gather together and yes, invest trust in each other in a way that maybe the financial system won't permit us to do in the future in the way that it has in the past. And that distinction you made at the beginning between, you know, those three different ways in which people end up cooperating. You know, either you force them to do it, or they do it by means of money, or they share a common vision. A common object of love, as St. Augustine put it, as the thing that holds the church together. So anyway, exciting times, interesting times, and you've helped us begin to till the soil to prepare for those. So many thanks for that. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in this evening in different parts of the country and indeed the world. It's the early hours of the morning in some places, I know that. So we're very grateful to you for giving us your time, for investing your time in our conversation tonight. And whether you're going to bed now or whether you're going to just, I don't know, open a bottle or something, whatever it is you have in view, I hope you have a very enjoyable rest of the evening. And we'll see you hopefully next month for the next in this installment of our Join Enough monthly talks. So go well, and see you again before too long.